121.601 is telling us that the dispatcher's job does not end when the flight departs. In fact, that at that point, the dispatcher's job is really critical too, because the flight crew may not be able to update themselves on pertinent information in flight, information that the company needs to pass on to the pilots, weather information, anything that happens with regards to important NOTAMs about equipment at the airport they're going to that maybe becomes out of service. So for kind of a real world example of where things can go really wrong, let's talk about a specific scenario. This happened when I was working for a charter airline, and we had some major problems due to, number one, there was a item that was inoperative on one of our airplanes, and that was the windshield heat system. And with the windshield heat system inoperative, we could fly the airplane. However, the flight could not take place if there was known or forecast icing conditions. And in this case, there was temperatures that were below freezing, and there was instrument meteorological conditions, so there was clouds, visible moisture. And that affected the flight significantly, because it actually couldn't operate on the day it intended to operate. Because not only was the windshield heat broken, there were very poor visibility in Worcester, Massachusetts, where the flight was actually supposed to go. So as the flight got delayed, it actually got delayed until the next day, just due to visibility that was lower than the required visibility for the approaches in Worcester. So the next day came around, the windshield heat issue was still not fixed, so we actually used another airplane to fly the flights the next day, or we tried to. We talked with the customer, who this was a little bit of a different scenario than some airlines, but because it was a charter airline, a customer had purchased the seats on the airplane. It wasn't actually sold through the airline I worked for. But that customer, they were the ones that set up where the airplane was to go. They were the ones that really wanted to go to Worcester, Massachusetts. So before we departed, we told the customer that it could very well be that the flight would have to divert because the visibility was poor. It was supposed to get better, so it was above landing minimums when the flight was to get to Worcester. But there was definite possibility that the flight was not going to be able to land at Worcester. And the customer at that point told the dispatcher that the flight should divert to Boston if it could not land at Worcester. And so we listed Boston as the alternate. The crew knew about this, told the crew that was their preferred alternate if they had to divert, if they could not land at Worcester. Prior to departure, we had a flight follower, the dispatcher essentially, told the crew that they should proceed to Worcester. If they couldn't land because of poor visibility, they should enter holding and contact the company. And here's where we are with the communications piece. The communications were not that good because what company was supposed to be called? Well, that wasn't really that clear. So we started entering our miscommunications phase of the problem. The flight did get to Worcester, and it did fly an approach, but it could not see the runway, and so the crew did a missed approach. They entered holding over Worcester and contacted the ground station at Worcester, and then the people on the ground there at Worcester basically said to do whatever diversion that they were told to do. So they began to divert to Boston. As this started happening, the flight follower had actually, while the flight was en route, had actually received a phone call from the customer that told the flight follower that they did not want the flight to divert to Boston anymore, that they wanted it to divert to Bradley because they didn't have any setup for Boston. They did not have a gate. They did not have anything really set up in Boston. So the flight follower thought that the flight was going to contact him if they had to do a missed approach. And at that point, he was planning to tell the crew to go to Bradley instead of Boston. But unfortunately, when the crew did their missed approach, they just ended up doing their original plan. So with this miscommunications going on, the flight diverted to Boston. they called the dispatcher from Boston and said, well, here we are, what gate do we go to? And the customer was pretty furious because they said, well, we wanted it to go to Bradley. In fact, the passengers are on buses going to Bradley. They're not on buses going to Boston to meet the flight. And there was nothing was set up. So it ended up really being, poor communication. So all around, poor weather, lots of things going on. And so again, the dispatcher's job does not end in flight. And this obviously requires the crew to communicate back with the dispatcher too, via is it radio or ACARS or cell call, as we've seen in previous presentations. They still need to communicate with the dispatcher, and the dispatcher needs to communicate with the crew while they're in flight for everything to work properly.